Yeah, so welcome, Jack. Welcome back. As we like to feature Jack at least once a year at the Ohio chapter. Thank you all for assembling. And Jack, when you and I talked about this, it's been a while since we talked about this. I think it might have been even RSA 2020. You expressed a lot of excitement about we'll call it this brainchild of yours. And I believe, if I quoted you correctly, you said you thought this could have a bigger impact on the profession than the fair ontology itself. So we're excited to have you give us this preview that will be, I guess, the big coming out party will be at FairCon in October. So appreciate you spending time with us to let us interact with you. And when if there's any questions you all have during the presentation, pop those in the chat. If it's appropriate, I'll interrupt Jack. Otherwise, we are trying to save about 15 minutes at the end for the Q&A time. So with that, Jack, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so let me share my screen and start this up. Let me know if you're seeing my slides.
Yeah, looking good.
All right, cool. All right. So this is an updated, refined version of a presentation I gave at RSA earlier this year. And as Mike said, this is something I've been working on, this controls analytics stuff for literally for years now. And in some respects, feel it's my best piece of work to date, and could potentially have an even bigger impact on our profession than FAIR has. But I think it's a little hard to say that with a straight face, because without FAIR, the application of this is muted to some degree. I mean, honestly, you don't need FAIR in order to gain value from this controls analytics model, but the two together are what I believe are going to be particularly powerful. So one other thing I'll add is that, feedback over the years with regard to FAIR, one thing I've heard over and over from people is, where are the controls in the model? And I've looked back at my development notes, scraps of paper and whatnot that I've accumulated over the years as I developed FAIR and such. And it turns out that I've been working on this for almost since the beginning of working on FAIR, trying to understand the controls piece. And it just eluded me. I would have little insights here and there, but the whole picture, kind of the big picture, just wasn't coming together. And then, and when I wrote chapter 11 of the FAIR book that was published in 2014, there's the chapter there on controls, and as I share what I'm covering today, those of you who are familiar with that chapter will see some familiar things. So as far as what's in that chapter, it was directionally correct, and I got a number of things in there correct, but I got some things wrong in there as well. And certainly what I had in that chapter was incomplete. And that's feedback I've gotten over and over from people about that chapter, is they said, really interesting, but I have no idea how to apply it. And that's because when I wrote the chapter, I had no idea how to apply it. So I wasn't holding back, I just didn't know. And now I feel as though, I've completed the picture with this. Now, does that mean this is perfect and immutable? No, it will continue to evolve. I'm certain of that. But I think it's at a point now, in fact, I'm certain it's at a point now where it can be applied, much more pragmatically. And I can paint a clearer picture of what it is I'm talking about in the first place. So having said all that, let's get into this and see if you agree with me or not. So let's see. All right. So some questions I like to ask up front of people. What's the most valuable control in your program? What's the least valuable control? And I've actually asked these questions of a few people, and to date, the first question, a couple of people have offered an answer, but their answers always seem to kind of line up with their area of speciality. So if they're a policy person, most important control of policies. If they're, security operations, then, it's something to do with that. So, that kind of bias is understandable, but I don't think their answer is defensible based on anything other than sort of, what they know about. The second question, nobody's even ventured an answer to, because that's scary ground, I think. I suppose some people might try to answer it, but I haven't talked to anybody who would. But here's the litmus test. Would your answers be the same as someone else's in your organization? And that's when people know that they're on really shaky ground if they've tried to answer either question. Because the answer to that is almost certainly no. And then the last question is essentially boils down to, as a profession who spends a tremendous amount of time on controls, don't you think we should be able to answer these questions? And for me, the answer to this question is, yeah, we absolutely should be able to evaluate and determine answers to these questions that can be defended. But today we can't as a profession. So if we're going to go down this track of talking about control value, we need to be on the same page with what we mean by value. And for me, is this, all right? The only value proposition for any control is its ability to affect the frequency or magnitude of loss, right? That is essentially the basis for measurement of value on controls. Now, other people may have different points of view on that, but this is where I'm coming from. This is the basis for the controls analytics that I'll be talking about. So if that's how we define a control's value, then shouldn't we be able to look at a control like this from ISO and go, hey, we can evaluate this and see how much less risk we have if we're doing this well, or how much more risk we have if we're doing this poorly or not at all, right? Again, that is, however, to date been an elusive problem to solve. And of course, we also then should be able to compare controls like security awareness versus access privilege management and say, hey, for our organization, this is more important than that for these reasons and by this much and that sort of thing. Again, not something we can do today as a profession. So what's been missing? Here's another question for you. In the practice of medicine, between anatomy and physiology, which one's more important? Well, the answer is neither. You need to know both. I mean, you have to know more than just the parts of the system. You have to know how the system works. And let's look at this in context of the human, the human body, if you will, or the human system. The spleen is an anatomical component. We can know how much, how its size and weight and where it should be located and that sort of thing. That's anatomy. And we can infer the purpose of it by observing people who have damaged spleens and, hey, they seem to be more susceptible to infections and that sort of thing. So we can infer, its purpose, but that doesn't mean we know how it works. We have to understand physiology if we want to, understand that part of the system and its relevance and how to treat it and the implications for different problems from it, and that sort of thing. And we have to know how it works both as an individual unit. So in this case, it filters blood via these things called white and red pulp. It does some other things too, but that's kind of the major function. And it's dependent on all these other parts of the body. And there are other parts of the body that are dependent upon it. And fortunately, if it's damaged or missing, then it can be partially compensated for. But the point here is that this is part of a system. It doesn't stand on its own, right? If other parts of the system aren't working properly, it can affect the spleen. If the spleen isn't working properly, it can affect other parts of the system. And in order to, measure its efficacy or, functional efficacy and that sort of thing, we have to understand it in the context of the system. Now, in cybersecurity, we can look at an anatomical component like awareness training, and we can say, well, this is what it should look like, and this is how often it should occur, and that sort of thing. And we can, again, sort of state what its purpose seems to be. But physiologically, we can look at it a little differently, right? The function is to actually to reduce the frequency of, problems with other controls, like passwords or access privileges or et cetera. And it's dependent upon policies and all these other parts of our risk management program in order for the awareness training to be what it needs to be. And it is dependent upon by all these other parts of the system. So again, this is part of the system. And the good news is that when it's deficient, other parts of the controls environment may help to mitigate those, deficiencies and their effect. So from my perspective, what our profession has focused on with the control frameworks that we have today is anatomy. Here are the parts of the system, and we're good at that. I mean, we have no shortage of anatomical lists, right? The ISOs and PCI DSSs and the NIST 853s of the world and all those sorts of things. And as anatomy, they serve a really important purpose, but they aren't enough. And because we've been focusing as a profession on anatomy, we've left the whole how the system works to the mental model of the professionals. And for something this profoundly complex, that's not a recipe for success. I mean, as I've gone through the process of trying to figure this out and develop, my controls analytics model, I've had a lot of opportunity to look back at how I've thought about controls and my own mental model around control physiology, and with some dismay over frankly, mistakes because I didn't understand it in any sort of rigorous manner. My mental model was incomplete or was, misaligned in one way, shape, or form. So the model itself, and I refer to this as essentially controls physiology for cybersecurity. Now, the one thing I'll point out, though, is that like FAIR, this is not only applicable to cybersecurity. It can be applied to any other form of risk as well. So the objectives of when I was developing this, I had certain objectives in mind. I wanted to be able to bridge the gap between anatomy and risk, because that's really the missing part. One of the areas, and those of you who've been practicing FAIR will probably relate to this, in that some of the hardest discussions you have in the process of doing a FAIR analysis is which controls apply and how do they affect risk and that sort of thing, and so this can simplify the heck out of it, and we're already experiencing that in our limited applications of this so far. It really simplifies the conversations around risk and the measurements of control effect and that sort of thing. Improves the reliability of control measurement. And one of my criteria as I developed this is the different model parameters have to be empirically measurable, every last one of them. And and the model stands up to that. That doesn't mean all of the parameters are necessarily easy to measure. And by that, I don't mean that there's something necessarily inherently complex with all of them or some of them, but many times it's simply because we as a profession haven't focused on physiology or these data points, these parameters. And so we may not have the data at hand that we would like to have for some of these. For some, we have plenty of data, for others, less so. But the bottom line is all of the parameters can be empirically measured. Yeah, again, accounting for the individual control functionality as well as how it plays in the system. And back to that data thing, you know, we have quite a bit of data of certain types in our profession. And in fact, I would argue the thing we have the most data about are controls, but it's not always the right data. It's not always the data it could or should be. But this should help us refine our data practices so that we can make better use of the data we have and we can go after the data we don't have. My aim is for this to be an industry standard like FAIR that'll be covered under Creative Commons sort of license, similar to how the Open Group and CIS protect their works. So setting some expectations, and you know, modern medicine isn't complex because the doctors and scientists got all nerdy. It's complex because human physiology is just really complex. Our problem space is complex too, and we have to account for that. The good news is the controls analytics isn't nearly as complex as human physiology, but it's way more complex than how we've approached controls as a profession to date. So just, you know, be aware of that, be prepared for it. But if we want to, again, measure controls effectively and therefore inform risk measurements and decision-making more effectively, then we have to account for that complexity. We can't just wish it were otherwise and brush it under a rug. It is what it is. We can either step up to that or continue to live in the matrix and pretend that, you know, the world isn't what it really is. And, you know, you've probably heard me say this over and over again, and I will say it again. No easy button. So clarifying terms, just controls anything that directly or indirectly affects the frequency or magnitude of loss. And that's an intentionally very broad statement. And we may or may not touch on some examples of how that will force us to think a little differently about some things than we are used to. We may get to that or not. But here's some examples of controls. Control functions. This is how a control directly or indirectly affects the frequency or magnitude of loss. And here's some examples. Now, you know, there's this notion of control functions in our industry today, and this CSF has 5 of them, right? That's how they've carved up the world. This FAIR controls analytics model has 26 functions. And again, this isn't Jack getting nerdy. This is, you know, a decomposition that is as best as I've been able to derive so far, an accurate representation of the different functions in our problem space. And it could, I have frankly simplified some of it too. I've made modeling trade-offs to make it more pragmatic. So it could be more than 26. So, you know, again, I'm trying to be pragmatic in this. But one of the reasons why there are so many is, again, if these functions are going to be empirically measurable, there has to be a unit of measure, you know, time or frequency or probability or dollars or something like that. And the fact that, or one of the contributing factors to, you know, the number of factors in this is that you can't munge together things that have different units of measurement, all right, and have it stand up. So again, more on that later. But some problems with the control functions as our profession has historically looked at them. They don't differentiate direct versus indirect effect on risk. They don't account for dependencies between controls. They're not nearly granular enough for verifiable measurement and that sort of thing. Now, NIST 853 does mention, this control is related to that control, but it doesn't describe the nature of the relationship. Is it the dependency in one direction, bidirectional? No idea there. And the threat kill chain analysis is somewhat similar superficially to this, but it has a very, very narrow scope. So, if you think of this in that terms, again, you may see some similarities there, but this is, I would submit, much deeper in that regard and more comprehensive. So you've heard me mention at least once already this notion of direct versus indirect effect on loss. And so you can think of there being two broad categories of controls. But let's look at this a little more closely. So we know that assets and threats, when combined, create risk. So we have controls that we put into place. Now let's be a little more specific. Instead of just labeling them controls, let's call them loss event controls. In other words, those things that directly affect the frequency or magnitude of loss. Here are some examples. And then we have what I refer to as variance controls or variance management controls, which affect the reliability of loss event controls. And more, we'll come back to more in a second. And some examples there: patching, auditing, awareness training, those sorts of things. Then we have decision support controls, which enable, appropriate expectation setting and prioritization and whatnot. And those affect loss event controls and variance controls. And some examples there: asset management, threat intelligence, et cetera. Okay. But variance controls also affect decision controls and other variance controls. You need reliability for decision controls and variance controls, not just loss event controls. And you have decision controls not just about loss event controls or variance controls, but about other decision controls. So you can begin to see some of the complexity involved here, and it can feel a little bit like Alice's rabbit hole. But when you start to play with it, it actually isn't that bad, and it makes a lot of sense. Now you can get very fractal with this and go down the rabbit hole, but pragmatically, that's I don't think that's a worthwhile endeavor. And again, that's something we can talk about another time. But you see, the three categories of controls or domains here: the loss event controls, variance management, and decision support, and their relationships to one another. And again, that directly affects risk, and this indirectly affects risk. So let's look at an example. So let's say we're worried about ransomware. Okay. And we have some loss event controls we've put into place, the people, personnel are a loss event control because, they get phishing emails and they either click or they don't click, right? They are a control function there, or they serve a control function there. But we have these other, loss event controls that are relevant to ransomware. And then we have variance controls, awareness training, auditing, et cetera, right? And decision support controls. Now, let's say we have a problem with deficiency in awareness training. Well, that can affect their ability to recognize phishing and increase the probability of them clicking on stuff they shouldn't click on, and that affects risk. But maybe that deficiency in awareness training comes from crappy threat intelligence. We don't provide sufficient description or information for the people taking the awareness training to reliably recognize phishing, right? So here again, we see how deficiencies in one part of the system can flow downstream to affect risk, affect other controls and thus risk. So the loss of end control functions are, prevention detection response is not anything new, but as you begin to go deeper, you see some things that, or some functions that may be a little not as familiar. Let me put it that way. I mean, the terms themselves are probably going to surprise anyone, but just again, making this an explicit part of the model and having units of measurement for each of these and knowing how they relate analytically to one another is what allows you to begin to take these measurements and do the analytics and have better measurements and better decisions. And we can look at this sort of as a chain of events. So we have threats, affect assets, resulting in loss events, primary and secondary effects. And I don't know why I get some misalignment in my text here, but sorry about that. And we can look at the prevention and mitigation opportunities. And we have avoidance controls that reduce contact frequency, and there's some examples. We have deterrence controls that reduce probability of action after contact has occurred between a threat agent and our assets. And resistive controls, making it harder for them to do their nefarious deeds or their accidental deeds, that sort of thing. For detection that enables timely response, we have to have visibility. We have to have the data with which to recognize that things aren't what they should be. We have to have monitoring, we have to look at the data. We have to have things that allow us to differentiate normal from abnormal. And from response, we have to regain control, contain the event, if you will. And we have to have resilience if it's an outage sort of event. And then it's nice if we have ways of mitigating the magnitude of loss, when the event occurs. So, this is an example of controls as applied through the control functions in the process of risk management. And again, these are loss event controls. I have similar ontologies for the variance management controls and decision support controls, but we're not going to spend time going through those today. The decision support controls are particularly interesting. That was the one that kicked my butt for a long time trying to figure this out. So combining, anatomy with physiology, the objective, we have these control frameworks, the NIST 853s, the CSFs of the world, the HITRUST, and those sorts of things. And, we want to combine those with controls physiology or FAIRCAM so that we can, do a better job of measuring and managing risk. And so, marrying the physiology and anatomy should get us there. Which I already talked about this too. And, a big advantage is then we can look at the gaps we have and make much more reliable and well-informed decisions about, how much they matter and which ones matter more. I believe that this can also help us refine our control anatomy frameworks. More on that in a minute. So begun mapping the CIS controls to FAIRCAM, and I chose CIS controls as a starting point for a couple of reasons. One, it's a manageable size. It's 171 or 2 controls versus hundreds or thousands in some of the other frameworks. But also, I felt they had been really pretty well defined. I've been impressed with the CIS control definition, their clarity and such. So I thought, let me start with something easy. And so did a first pass at the mapping, and we're refining that now. Hang on for a second. I've got a bit of a cough, and it's not COVID. So, so it started with CIS, and we can look at one of those, and it maps very cleanly to one node in controls analytics model. But there were challenges in going through that. So, the CIS has this utilized centrally managed anti-malware software. That's one of their control elements. But they don't actually have anti-malware software as a distinct control element anywhere in there. So here's this thing that from controls physiology perspective is a variance management control, central management of anti-malware. And yet nowhere in CIS is the loss event control, anti-malware, called out, right? So I think this could be a way to, using FairCam to help some of these frameworks make refinements in some respects. And this is an example of that. Another entry here, monitor and block. Well, those are two very different functions. So here's a control element in CIS that actually fits into more than one part of the controls analytics model. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. It's just when it comes time to apply these frameworks in risk measurement, that munging together of dissimilar functions is going to create some challenges from a measurement perspective. I don't think that's intractable or means that you don't get value from the exercise of marrying these two things up. It's just, it forces some measurement trade-offs in terms of generalization, that will make the resulting scores or measurements not as useful as they might otherwise be. And then you have something like this that is really just covers so many different things that, a measurement of, certainly an ordinal measurement of something like this, trying to interpret that through the controls physiology model or FairCam. Yeah, I'm not sure how well that's going to work. So again, some challenges. And again, I chose CIS because I thought by and large, they were the most well-written control descriptions. NIST-CSF is going to be a special, yeah, NIST-CSF is going to be special. 853, I think might not be too bad because it's so granular, but there's just so many of them. Yeah, I already talked about or alluded to CSF. It's, it's just so broadly written and imprecise in its definitions that the mapping, I'm not sure how much value is going to be found there. We'll see. So wrapping up, from my perspective, if we want to be as good as we can possibly be in managing our problem space, we have to be able to answer the questions about which controls provide the most or least value, overall or in certain circumstances and whatnot. We can't do that today because all we know is anatomy. And therefore, we have these sorts of problems. FairCam is intended to be the bridge, provide that physiology view. And you combine that with FAIR, and I think we're in a really good position to evolve our practices and our value proposition as a profession pretty significantly. And here's a quote from a colleague of mine. His grandfather's a retired surgeon, and they were having a conversation, and his grandfather said this, and I thought that is like a perfect description of where we are as a profession today. Back in the 1800s, they understood anatomy. They knew that, very thoroughly. but they didn't know how anything worked. And that certainly limited their efficacy as a profession, just as I believe it affects us as a profession. So more to come at FairCon. It's going to be sort of the coming out party for this. We'll have complete ontologies, more about control efficacy, units of measurement, more details about everything, including how the model accounts for human behavior. And we intend to have at least one paper available that shows the mapping between, one of the frameworks in FairChem. The one I'm certain of is the CIS controls. We have working groups underway right now that are tackling mapping HITRUST CSF, NIST 853, and ISO are all in the process of being mapped to FairChem 2. Where those will be by FairCon, I don't know, but they're being worked on actively. So that's all I got. Hopefully you found that halfway interesting and thought-provoking, and hopefully there are some questions.
Very good, Jack. Thank you. And I know it's always tough to go 30 minutes without interacting with anybody, so appreciate the effort there. Yeah, let's see if we can't get some interaction going here with the audience. There's a lot to digest. Apps, I know you got a question teed up. Why don't you go ahead and start the interaction?
Absolutely. Jack, always fantastic. You're a brilliant man, and your mind works in mysterious ways, but well above my pay grade. So fantastic work. I applaud your brainchild yet again. Yet again, your contribution to the industry and society at large. But in any case, enough of that. Question for you is can you give us just a little hint, a taste maybe, of how you think in practicality? I mean, the framework's fantastic, but practically, how's this going to be measured? I'm assuming there's going to have to be a lot of automation, but I don't want to make too many assumptions, right?
Well, yeah, certainly, ideally, we'll be able to automate a significant portion of this, ingesting telemetry from tools and all that good stuff. And the good news is this actually is not going to be terribly hard to put into software. Now let me walk back from that a little bit. Hard is a relative term. So it depends on how comprehensively you want to apply it. If you want to evaluate an organization's entire technology landscape through this model, that's not going to happen overnight. Writing the software to do that is not going to happen overnight. If you want to evaluate individual scenarios and those sorts of things, that's not difficult at all. I actually have a prototype that I've written myself that I'll be displaying at FairCon that applies this in scenario analyses and gives you, I like to think it's pretty eye-opening what it can do. But so yeah, as much as possible, we'll want to automate it. But just like FAIR, as someone earlier on the call today said, they're adopting the ontology because that it's helps to refine mental models and conversations around risk and that sort of thing. And this functions the exact same way in that regard. It provides us with clearer language and at least in my experience, significantly refined and clarified mental models around controls, so that even in the absence of an application, just being able to say, all right, this audit found this gap, in this control, but hey, when you look at this through the lens of controls analytics model, we can see all of these other controls that are in place are relevant to that same to the same loss event scenarios that the gap was found in. And because these variance management controls are in place and et cetera, we're confident in the reliability of those other controls. So, at the end of the day, this auto fighting is not high risk, right? So it gives us, again, I think, an opportunity to think this way and operate this way incrementally. And so, don't hold out for automation on this in terms of, how you apply it. I at least for myself and the colleagues that I've worked with on this, just having the model to use as a way to look at the problems and think about the controls and gaps in controls or opportunities to improve controls, those sorts of things. I think there's a ton of value here before we even get to numbers, let alone, automation.
Yeah, and just a quick comment on that. I was thinking the same kind of journey with FAIR. There's the value of FAIR, crunching the numbers, right? Getting the probability distributions on the output, right? All that stuff. But then there's just the framing of the issue. And there's a ton of value of just framing the issue through the FAIR lens. And I think there's some of that, at least for me, I'm seeing some of that with the new FAIR Cam. So, so that's pretty cool. Thanks.
And there will be some surprises. When I was developing this and was running it through my prototype and that sort of thing, there were a couple of times I went, what? How can that be? But then when you examine it, it's like, damn, I've been wrong about that forever. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Hey, we got some good questions coming in here, Jack. So we'll start last in. Which version of CIS controls is FairCam being mapped to?
The latest, the one that it's either just published or about to be published. I forget which.
And a question also from Mosey.
Mosey.
I think I'm going to read it. Can there be loss event controls for loss event controls? So I can see a resilience argument for that.
So depending on how you interpret the question, yes, but one of the things this enables is an architectural articulation, if I can use those terms together like that, architectural articulation of defense and measurement of defense in depth. So there, this is, you can apply this in ways where I can answer his question, yes, based on kind of how I'm interpreting the question and where I think he's going for. So let's land on yes, and we can get into more details if, excuse me, if need be.
Okay. Next question. What level of FairCam implementation is needed to help decision on control prioritization? So examples, given a backlog of X controls, which ones do I invest in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if an organization has gone to the trouble, as all organizations should, I believe, to identify the loss event scenarios that are most relevant to them in terms of the bad outcomes they're trying to avoid and the different ways in which those outcomes can materialize, then you can overlay these controls onto that population of scenarios, and through this analysis say, you know what, these controls just flat matter more than those controls, and this is where we need to focus, and again be able to describe both in measured terms and just logically why that is, why that's the case. So yeah, we should be able to know where we need to focus and which things need to be dealt with first and such.
Very good. How do you feel about the equation risk equals likelihood times impact? And is this used empirically in your CAM?
Yes, this absolutely. I mean, it's risk is what it is. It's still this likelihood and impact problem, and the controls model maps explicitly to that. Right? We have those loss event controls that affect likelihood, and we have those loss event controls that affect impact, and then we have all these indirect controls, the variance management and decision support, that affect those loss event controls and other controls and whatnot. So yeah, the equation still stands, and this speaks directly to it.
Excellent. When you see a corresponding control register to support this new framework where all the controls are tracked and categorized, similar in concept to the risk register?
Yeah, absolutely. I would argue that risk registers and GRC products today, if I were king of the world for a day, I would decree that all such risk registers and GRC products have a risk register, and in the risk register it would be the loss event scenarios that again are most relevant to the organization. That's what would be in the risk register. Then you would have a controls register, is essentially here are all the controls we have in the organization, and which of these loss event scenarios they're relevant to, or which, if they're loss event controls, if they're variance management or decision support, which, where are they mapped? But again, you would absolutely have a register for controls that would be mapped to, associated with, the FairCAM functions.
From James Middleton, a visionary.
No, it's wishful thinking. I'd really love to have something like that, because when we talk about controls, everyone is all over the place, and I love this idea of being able to categorize these in a way that makes a lot of sense. So when somebody's talking about a control, he's probably talking about a particular piece of software, whereas another person is talking about an organization or something, right? And so having something like this laid out ownership-wise, would just be fantastic.
That's my hope. Yeah.
Okay. From Natalie, what level of proficiency with FAIR is needed to be able to leverage CAM? And building on that question, how much of your overall network risk program has to be mapped out, identified, and quantified to apply the FAIR CAM?
You don't have to map out or quantify any part of your program to gain value from this. As I said before, just having this model as a way to frame critical thinking about the problems we face and that sort of thing, and have clearer, more explicit conversations with colleagues and fewer religious arguments. Those are value propositions for this as well. As for depth of experience with FAIR, I would argue you don't have to have much experience at all. And I would also submit that having this, let me put this way, to be, I think, a really strongly competent FAIR practitioner today, you have to be a strong enough critical thinker to think reasonably well about controls within the analyses you're doing. This should actually lower the bar in terms of the skills required to do FAIR analysis or risk analysis, because this will provide a lot of clarity and reduce the amount of hard thinking that's required in the course of doing an analysis. And particularly when we're able to, have more sources of data around controls, better sources of the right data around controls. I mean, if anything, it'll make it the application of FAIR more accessible to more people.
Answer. Stephen Kyle, you raised your hand. Do you want to go off mute and ask your question?
Actually, it already got answered, fortunately. It was about the version of CIS controls. I'm a great fan of the CIS controls, and maybe a follow-on question would be, Jack, when you were trying to define this, did you look at the measurements they provide, the Six Sigma? And did that guide your measurements as far as how to quantify them?
No.
Okay. They have an auditing tool that you can use that's based on Six Sigma, and that's what we're trying to implement now. So I was curious if you had looked at that. That's all. Thank you.
Question from Aaron Shaw regarding the ontology. When you say variance controls, are these controls that ensure consistency across assets, or are you define it another way?
Yeah, they are essentially controls that affect the frequency and duration of control deficiencies. So let's think about software, a web application. Remember that really broad definition I mentioned earlier for what is a control, anything that can directly or indirectly affect the frequency or magnitude of loss. That's the definition of control. Well, a web application is a control in the sense that if it's well written, i.e. not exploitable, it performs, its efficacy as a resistive control is high. If it's chock full of exploitable conditions, its resistance efficacy is crap. So, but the bottom line is software in this context then is a loss of end control, the web application itself. And so the things we do to reduce the frequency of deficiencies in it as a control. So things like training programmers to write secure code, things like pre-production, testing of code, and that sort of, that prevents or reduces the frequency of exploitable variant conditions in the software. But crap still happens. So we have other things like vulnerability scanning is a variance identification control that tells us, hey, this isn't what it should be. And maybe it's not because the development process broke down, but maybe it's because the bad guys came up with a new 0 day. That happens too. So that's another source of variance. It doesn't have to be somebody broke the control. It could be, hey, there's a new way to attack it. But regardless, we have these variance identification controls like vulnerability scanning. And then we have things like patching, which is a vulnerability remediation control, right? So, that's an example of how variance affects essentially the efficacy, the operational performance is what I refer to it as, of loss of end controls. Is that helpful? Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah. So you're trying to enhance the predictability of the controls, or these are trying to make things more predictable? Is that a better way to come at it?
Yeah, that's certainly one way to describe it. For me, it's I guess if your goal is predictable, the term I haven't thought of it in that context. How I've always thought about it, at least to date, is the operational performance. So, for example, if we refer to the web application as a resistive control, our intended performance for it is to not be exploitable, right? We want its resistive efficacy to be at 100%. Well, reality raises its ugly little head, and we know that 100% isn't going to be true 100% of the time. So what we want to do is improve what I refer to as the operational performance. So you have intended performance, and then you have reality, which is the operational performance of controls, which is a function of both the intended performance and the frequency and duration of variant, conditions in those controls. So for me, I use the terms, I'm not saying they're the right terms.
Yeah, that was just the one phrase that I thought about it in a couple of different ways, and I was just curious how you were coming at it.
Yeah. So I think about it in terms of intended performance versus operational performance. And you can think of, predictability is, a very similar sort of perspective, but, I just landed on operational performance. I'm not sure it's better. It's just what it is.
Call it Alice and be done.
There you go. It's Alice.
Two more questions, so then we'll wrap in 3 minutes here. Since it may not be feasible to calculate control risk value for all risk event scenarios, please recommend an approach, a starter kit of sorts. You focus on something like the top 10. So maybe it's a matter of how many scenarios should you be considering here against the control framework?
Well, so it's an interesting question. The permutations with which loss events can occur, hypothetically, is virtually infinite. But in reality, we can narrow down or filter loss event scenarios to land on sort of some common varieties that are vastly more common than the others. And so that sort of limits the problem space in that regard. But a lot of the controls apply to multiple scenarios. So, it's, again, there are ways in which this an application will be simpler than one might imagine. But on the other hand, too, this is new stuff. And so I can state with pretty high confidence that, we will have, there will be some learnings to be had as we apply this in more ways and more often, and again, I firmly suspect that that the model itself will evolve. No models are perfect out of the gate. This would be no exception. But at this point, I'm very confident that it's good enough. I wouldn't make it public or release it if I wasn't confident it's good enough to make a significant difference. But I think I don't think its application will be as complicated or needs to be as complicated as one might imagine. It certainly can be if we wanted it to be, but I don't think we need to go there, at least out of the gate.
I want to slip a question in myself. I was just kind of reflecting back 2007, 8, and the first implementation of RiskLens like 2.0, where it was trying to bring to an enterprise application what you had called Thoroughfare.
Yeah, the beast.
Yeah, but I was also thinking, well, Thoroughfare was your first run at trying to be able to give a enterprise view of cyber risk, and you were able then to do the sensitivity analysis and come up with some really great insights. Is that kind of where we're heading here again? Maybe a more sophisticated approach?
Yeah, this is far more sophisticated, but the goal is the same. This should be able to, our objective is to develop an application that that can be a recommendation engine. Will apply AI sorts of processes and technologies to examine a cyber risk landscape and say, here, and given the industry you're in, the assets you have, and the threats you face, here are the controls that that are most relevant, most cost effective, and the best ways in which to manage a variance and all that sort of stuff. So should be a very powerful tool in that regard. I believe, a number of years ago, I wrote a rudimentary genetic algorithm for risk management. just as really as an exercise to, for me to figure out how to apply genetic algorithms to this sort of thing. But the genome I used was crap. It wasn't particularly useful or accurate, but allowed me to, again, become familiar with genetic algorithms and how to apply them. I believe this model really will form the basis for a genome for genetic algorithms around risk management. So I'm excited about that application too. But that's I think we're only scratching the surface with the implications of this. So stay tuned.
Right. Awesome. Well, let's flip this last question in and we'll be done. It's ICECOM published the open source security testing methodology manual, OSSTMM. It's in the chat if you want to grab that. Are you familiar with OSSTMM? Okay.
No.
So there's a link to it. Yeah.
Might have to look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, it's, I think what we'll find, what I've seen already at least, excuse me, is that how we've gone about measuring controls to date has pretty much missed the point. But not completely, not certainly in all circumstances, but
yeah,
too often. And so this should help us recalibrate our metrics programs. And one of the things that I firmly believe this will enable is developing KRIs and KPIs that we are confident are the right KRIs and KPIs, and we can explain why, this line, if we go below it, how much more risk it's going to represent, and why it's a KRI, a KPI, that sort of thing. As opposed to today, I think, we take our best shots in the dark about, which things we believe should be KRIs and where the thresholds are, but they're not based on anything analytically. And this should fix that.
very exciting, Jack. Thank you so much for joining us today, for briefing us on FairCam. Hopefully, everybody, FairCon 21 is going to be both virtual as well as in person. So there's no.
No, actually, just virtual now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that's what I heard. So
okay,
I'm not 100% sure that that's the case, but if I'm a betting man,
okay,
that's what I'm betting for. We've seen a few conferences try to have in-person attendance, and attendance is like 25% of what they were aiming for. And a lot of organizations just are not approving travel. So
yeah, that's true. That's true. My organization.
yeah,
I was going to have to figure that out. Yeah.
I don't think it will be in person.
Okay. Well, then there's no excuse to miss it at all. It's virtual.
That's right. No excuse.
That's right. So we'll look forward to hearing from you then. So again, thank you everybody for joining us and hanging with us for the full hour and a half, and hopefully see you in person in one of our regional get-togethers. So thank you all for joining and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, Jack. Fantastic job. Thanks, everyone. Take care.